Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to talk to you today about how we should remember the Kanto Massacre. And Korea Now did a good segment on that. Some things I agreed with, some things I didn't, but let's get on to what I agree with. I do think that the Kanto Massacre did happen in 1923. There was a great Kanto earthquake in Japan, and over 100,000 people died. It was actually closer to 150,000. I believe the figures were 142,899, if I'm not mistaken. People perished. Most were ethnic Japanese, but some were ethnic Koreans that were either brought to Japan forcibly when Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945. Some went from Korea to mainland Japan on their own accord because they thought going to mainland Japan would afford them better economic opportunities at the time. Well, Koreans at the time were allowed to form a labor union, and the reason the labor union was formed was because there was a lot of discrimination against Korean workers in Japan, and these Korean workers were not even being paid a tenth of what Japanese workers were being paid. And some Japanese sympathized with Koreans, actually a lot did, and they helped Koreans form their labor unions and run them, and some Japanese sympathized with them. Well, when the earthquake happened, this labor union offered assistance. They thought offering food assistance would be one of the better ways to show that Koreans were not out to get Japan, and to help have better wages and better working conditions in the workplace. Well, many Japanese people, well, not many Japanese people, but the Japanese government said that the Koreans tried to poison the food, which they didn't do, by the way. That was false reports. There's never been confirmed. The foods were not poisoned at all. Well, many people either believed the government propaganda or they were scared to do anything differently because they were scared the imperial Japanese government, which wasn't democratic at the time, was going to kill them. Well, 6,000 Koreans died. Well, not all of them were Koreans. Most were Koreans, but there were also Japanese sympathizers. Two Koreans, Japanese sympathizers, and Koreans died, and it was about 6,000 people total. And then even Japanese history books now try to either hide the situation, or they try to say it didn't exist. Now, there have been a number of college academics in both Japan and South Korea that have tried to get the Japanese government to put it back in their history books, and they've signed petitions on it, and the situation is better than what it used to be. There is somewhat of an acknowledgement, more than there was in the past, over it. Okay, now with that being said, I don't think it plays a role to some xenophobia that happens in Japan now. I've been to Japan 3 times. I love Japan when I was there. But there are some foreigners. Most foreigners go to Japan are okay and good people, but there's a small but not insignificant portion of foreigners that go in there and start bar fights. They get an apartment, they don't pay the rent, then they leave and they go home in their own country, or they leave an apartment a mess. So that makes some Japanese leery of non-Japanese people. That's why when there's floods or disasters, they think foreigners poison the wells, or they loot homes. And sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But many Japanese people do believe the reports when it does happen, whether if it's true or not. If the news reports on it, whether if it's true or not, a lot of them do believe it. But I've seen foreigners in Japan commit more crimes on average than Japanese people in Japan. But let's get back to the topic at hand. Okay, but the Kanto Massacre was a tragedy, and while I don't think the Japanese government needs to apologize, because the Japanese government now is not the Japanese government in 1923, that was almost 100 years ago. I don't agree with academics in Korea and Japan there. They do not need to try to keep it out of their history books. When I read American history textbooks, I read about the oppression of Native Americans, slavery in America, wars that America should have not been in, but also wars that America should have been in. I read the positive. When I was in history class, I learned the positives of American history, which were more than the negatives, but I also learned the negatives. So you need to put the positives and the negatives of your country's history in the textbook. And the Kanto Massacre should have not happened. It was a scar, and it was believed on false reports. The Japanese government got scared because in 1919, the Korean independence movement started in Korea, and they believe it spilled over to Koreans in Japan, which wasn't necessarily the case. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. Take care. God bless, and bye-bye. Bye-bye.